Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of Brown People Problems, a podcast where we chat about situations and circumstances that are unique to brown folks. And for today's episode, we are talking about boundaries. Now, it is such a hyped up topic. We hear about boundaries everywhere. So today we're going to talk about not just boundaries, but also 5 signs that you probably need some boundaries in your life. So if you've heard a lot about boundaries, if you're curious about what boundaries are and how they can be of help to you, then certainly keep listening. Of course, everything that we're going to be talking about today is more of an introduction on the topic of boundaries. The things that I'm going to be sharing today are more sort of from my own understanding and my own learning of boundaries that is informed by research and informed by the principles that exist in the field of mental health, and also from the work of Nedra Tawwab. She is a therapist in the States and a really lovely author on a great book on boundaries, and I believe she has a new book on family drama as well. So if you're looking for further reading or if you're looking for more of a resource, then certainly check out Nedra Tawwab's book. It's called Set Boundaries, Find Peace. All right, so let's get started with 5 signs that you need boundaries. Sign number 1, you have no time for self-care. There's literally just no time in your day. And you often find yourself telling people that oh yeah, I couldn't enjoy my weekend. There's just no time. There's so much to do. So sign number 1, you feel like you have no time for self-care. Sign number 2, you feel overwhelmed with everything. There's a constant feeling of just overwhelm and feeling like you have so much to do and so much is going on, and you're always feeling wired. Either you're feeling really wired or you're feeling just like you've crashed. And often you're just oscillating between those two states. Sign number 3, you feel really envious or really resentful of others. So this can look like saying things like, oh, how come they get to do what they want and I have to do X, Y, and Z, right? So feeling jealous, envious, resentful of others in your relationships. Sign number 4, you're just avoiding things. So that looks like making commitments and not showing up, making commitments and canceling, hoping your problem's gonna go away, right? Ghosting, cutting people off, that sort of thing. And sign number 5, there's lots and lots of tension and drama in your relationships. So to recap, 5 signs that we need boundaries. Sign 1, we have no time for self-care. We feel overwhelmed with everything. We feel envious and resentful of others. We feel like we're avoiding things. And there's lots of drama and tension in our relationships. Now, if any of those sound like something that you have felt at some point or other in your life, keep listening, because now we're going to break it down a little bit. So let's backtrack for a moment. What are boundaries, right? Let's define them. So if I Google the definition of boundary, according to Google, it's a line that marks the limit of an area, right? So when we talk about boundary, I'm thinking of a fence, right? This is mine, this is yours, that's a boundary. It's a dividing line that separates the limits of each area. Similarly, boundaries in relationships, boundaries in life are literally just limits, right? It's a way to communicate your needs, expectations, and limits in a relationship. So 3 things: needs, expectations, limits in a relationship. You might be thinking, okay, but why do we need boundaries? Boundaries really help us feel safe in relationships. They help us feel comfortable in situations. And again, they help us know what are our limits, right? So if there's no dividing line between 2 people's houses, for example, 2 people, there's no dividing line between their front yard or between their backyards, they're not going to really know where one's backyard ends and the other one's begins. There needs to be some sort of a marker. It can be similar in relationships. Boundaries just looks like the ability to say yes when we want and say no when we want. It looks like us communicating our needs, our expectations, our values to others, And that can leave us feeling comfortable, safe, valued, respected in a relationship. If two neighbors don't have a boundary between, like in their backyards, then I could walk into my neighbor's backyard and that could be upsetting for them, but I don't know that I'm crossing a boundary, right? For me, it's just a shared space. So similarly, in relationships, if we don't communicate our needs and expectations and desires and our limits, then there can be like a lot of crossover. If we look at this in the context of some of those signs that I had talked about, so feeling like you have no time for self-care, often this is a boundary issue, because that means that either we're tired because there's no like main reason. It's not like you are exercising so much that you're tired. Chances are, if you have boundary issues, you don't even have time for like self-care like that, right? What is actually exhausting is our inability to say no. And our habit of saying yes constantly is what leaves us exhausted, because we sign up for a lot more than we can handle, and we're not able to say no to what we don't want. Or we want to say no, but we don't know how to say no, and we end up prioritizing everybody else over ourselves. A lot of things can inform this, right? We can have like guilt at saying no, fear of saying no, and we'll get into that in a bit. Similarly, when you're feeling overwhelmed with everything, because you're having a hard time saying no, you are going to be pulled in so many different directions. You're not going to be able to structure your time, because now there are going to be competing priorities. Feeling overwhelmed with everything, feel like you have no time for yourself, this can really start to show up like difficulty sleeping, because you're so probably wired that you're not able to sleep. Or when you are able to sleep, you're not really getting that restful sleep. Feeling like there's not enough hours in the day, feeling like there's just one thing after another, that you need to do or that needs your attention. And so now, because we're not setting limits, we're not setting boundaries, when we start to see other people live the kind of life that we want to live, we can start to get resentful. So this can really create feelings of like jealousy. Like, how come they get to do whatever they want? How come they get to, just go off and live their life and I have to do all of this? Or how come they just get to, after having dinner, go and watch TV and I have to clean up all the dishes, right? Like a very simplistic but a common experience and a common complaint that we hear. Because if you're always doing things for others without setting limits, then you are always going to be giving more than you are getting. And that is just naturally bound to feel anybody resentful. And often those of us who, are yes people, we say yes a lot, we don't have boundaries. There ultimately does come a time when you just don't have the resources or the bandwidth to keep up with everything that you've promised or that you've said you'd show up for. And then you have ultimately this situation where you end up disappointing people, or you just can't show up, like you don't have enough energy, you're burned out. Then we start avoiding things. So we don't show up to our commitments. We start ghosting people. We make plans, but we cancel, or, we make excuses for why we can't be there. We just hope my problem's going to go away. We start cutting people off, maybe ghosting people as well, right? So we hear that so much in dating situations and perhaps even in other relationships, but, feeling unhappy with what someone said or doing something, and then you just decide to ghost them. So disappearing on people is really just the ultimate form of avoidance. And so there can also be like a lot of tension and drama in your relationships. So there's two ways that I really kind of see this manifest in people that I work with, but also within, my own life that I've witnessed with others. And when there's so much drama and tension in our lives and in our relationships, this now can spill over onto people that you love. So for example, if you have a partner, if you're in a marriage, like a partnership, if you are not able to set boundaries, say for example, with your family, it can leak into now how your partner is perceived by your family, and your family can project their expectations of you onto your partner, right? Because they can see you as a unit. So, oh, if you are the one who's doing everything for the family, for example, then it's not a big leap for them to start seeing your partner in the same capacity as well. So it can start to deteriorate people's relationships, because when people tell me that I don't have time for myself, what I'm also really hearing inside is I don't have time for my relationships. I don't have time for my partner. I don't have time for my parents. I don't have time for my friendships, which is why I feel like my friendships have deteriorated. I just don't have enough time. Another way that tension and drama can show up is when we don't have boundaries. We tend to overshare when we just meet people right away. So, maybe people listening know of someone, we all know that one person who tends to overshare things, right? So they meet someone, and within like half an hour of knowing them, they've casually mentioned their traumas, they've casually, mentioned some of like the more vulnerable, deeper things that most of us would keep on the back burner for another time. And the problem with this is when we don't have boundaries in that sense and what we're kind of sharing with someone right off the bat, that leaves us open for a lot of manipulation. So because we are not going to be able to judge everyone within the first half an hour of whether this person is emotionally safe or whether this person is possibly like manipulative. So you're at the risk of being manipulated, being used, and being hurt in the future. So you can kind of see how this creates this. This really is like a culmination of so many different factors and so many different layers, but it really becomes like this like self-fulfilling feedback loop, right? Where we don't know how to set boundaries. Even if we want to, we don't know how to set boundaries. Then we give too much, which sets us up for more resentment and envy, which makes us like more miserable, which makes us maybe think, okay, I need to give more. If I do more, then people will see how nice I am, or people will see who I am. And it's just such a cycle. But this stuff is really easier said than done. Boundaries are really hard to set, and they are, in all fairness, boundaries are a Eurocentric concept. So brown folks, brown communities, despite, I think, the variation in our cultures, in the brown subgroup, boundaries is not a concept that naturally exists for so many of us, right? I'm sure there's families out there, brown families out there, brown groups out there that actually do have really good boundaries. And I know several people in my personal life who have great boundaries with their families. But the larger trend is that boundaries don't exist. Boundaries can be seen as this like bad thing, right? There's just like a lot of enmeshed boundaries. And enmeshed boundaries just means, like my backyard is your backyard is my backyard. We have no boundary, right? So people are always just like stepping on each other's toes. We often see this in the context of, for example, joint families. There are little to no boundaries in many joint families, and that is usually what does create conflict so many of the times, right? There isn't a clear communication of what's okay, what's not okay, what do you need, what do you want, what do they need, what do they want, and that's bound to create chaos. So yes, it is a bit of a Eurocentric concept. However, it can be adapted to fit. I think, our cultural group as well. So if everything that I've been saying so far has been resonating with you, let's think a little bit more about what are some things that keep you from setting boundaries. So there could be, of course, a number of reasons, but there's some really common reasons. Number one is, first of all, not even knowing you need boundaries. So maybe if you've listened to all of these signs and listened to this conversation, some of you may be going, oh my gosh, this sounds just like me. I need boundaries. So sometimes we don't even know we need boundaries. We know something is wrong. Like we're not feeling maybe all that great about how we're living life. We're not feeling all that great about our relationships, but we're not able to pinpoint it to like a lack of boundaries. So that's certainly one piece. Now, you may know that you need boundaries, but what's stopping you is not knowing how to set a boundary, because it's a skill, right? It's a skill that takes a lot of practice, so we don't know the know-how around it. Boundaries is a topic that can also evoke a lot of guilt within so many of us. We feel this weird sense of guilt at not being able to prioritize ourselves over others. And it doesn't even have to be over other people. I think this is where maybe there can be some like misinformation around boundaries. That it's not always a competition between your needs and the other person's needs. There can be enough space on the table for everyone's needs, but often we don't even value our own needs on the same level as other people's needs if boundaries are an issue for us. So feeling guilty at prioritizing yourself as well. That's a really big one. Not knowing when to say no. Not knowing when to say no can really show up in work, right? So taking on more than what you can handle. It can show up in relationships. So, for a lot of brown girls, it looks like not being able to say no to perhaps like their partners or their parents for something. You constantly feel like you have to say yes to everything. I guess like a little bit more kind of extreme version of this can be people pleasing, right? People pleasing by definition is really just waving everybody else's flag but your own. There's also Nedra Tawwab calls it the superhero syndrome, and I love the language around that. But superhero syndrome can also get in the way of us setting boundaries. And superhero syndrome is basically like this idea that I can do it all. I can do everything. And I wonder how much of that is also informed by like the larger hustle culture that we live in right now, that we're exposed to, as well as just maybe how we have seen maybe our immigrant parents live life. And I think there's certainly this pressure to do it all, especially for a lot of brown women. There's a pressure to be successful in your career, pressure to have a family, pressure to be a present parent with the family, but pressure to also make X amount of money and have like a certain degree. And it's a lot. And we buy into that by thinking we can do it all. And certainly it's possible to do a lot with really great boundaries. But when we maybe start buying into this idea that I have to be able to do it all, I wonder if it's just creating unnecessary pressure and burden for little reward. And the one most important piece in this is I get folks telling me all the time, well, I set a boundary and nothing happened. Well, there's two parts to setting a boundary. There's the communication of the boundary that, I'm sorry, I cannot help you build your furniture today. So you've communicated your boundary, but there's also action. That's a second part of the boundary. So you actually following through with the boundary, right? Boundaries it's not enough to just say it. You have to enforce it. You have to reinforce it. You have to hold it strong, and you have to follow through with it. Because most of us, when we set boundaries, we think that, okay, I've set a boundary and perfect, I should be good. But more often than not, what happens, especially in our communities, is once you've set a boundary, the boundary gets questioned. The boundary gets poked. The boundary just gets ignored. Or people start testing your limits, right? So you get responses like, oh, why can't you help me build my furniture? Why can't you help me? Do you think you could help me 2 days from now? Right? There isn't so much of a respect of the boundaries. And because we get that pushback, we drop our boundaries. We just dissolve, let them dissolve, and we don't reinforce them. So not following through with action of the communication of the boundary is a really, really big one as well. Now, we can certainly talk a lot about what it looks like to set a boundary, and we can go a lot more into detail with this. So if you want to hear more on this, definitely let me know your thoughts. And I can make a subsequent, and I'd be happy to share a subsequent episode on this topic. But essentially, the art of boundary setting is also this art of assertiveness, to be able to say no to what you don't want and to be able to ask for what you want, right? So it can look like, I'm not able to help you build your furniture. However, I can be available next week to help you with X, Y, and Z, right? Or it can look like, I'm not able to help you build your furniture. However, if there's anything else that you need 3 weeks from now, that's when I anticipate having more time, I'd be happy to support, right? So it requires an art of assertiveness and being succinct with what we're saying, and not over-explaining or oversharing. So as we talk about this today, let me know which signs resonate the most with you, and what you find holds you back from setting boundaries, or if you do set boundaries, what generally has your experience been like? Because the guilt and the pushback that we get from others, these are the two main things that I notice stop people from setting boundaries or letting go of the boundaries that they have set. Another thing that has folks feeling weird about setting boundaries can be this belief that setting boundaries is rude, or it's wrong, you're being rude. If that's something that's coming up for you, first of all, boundaries are not rude. There is a way to be firm yet also polite. And if they feel like they are rude, I'd be curious to know where you learned that setting boundaries is rude. Like, who have you seen maybe set boundaries in a way that maybe perhaps was rude? Or where have you seen this type of behavior that you would call rude at setting boundaries? Where have you learned this? If we can be a little bit curious about where our beliefs about boundaries come from, then I think that can help us be better equipped to set our own boundaries and develop our own relationship with boundaries. Again, if you want to know more about this topic, I will certainly leave Nedra Tawwab's book linked in the description of this episode. Check it out and let me know your thoughts. What comes up for you as we talk about boundaries? And we can certainly talk about it again. But that's it for this week's episode. Hopefully this was something that maybe provided a little bit more clarity for you in terms of boundaries. It's a hot topic. We hear about it all the time. It's a very insta hot topic. Hopefully this provides a little bit more clarity for you and gets you thinking a little bit about boundaries. You don't have to start setting boundaries right away if you think there's more work there for you, but just familiarizing yourself with the topic perhaps a little bit more. As always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to everyone who is a recurring visitor and who joins me every single week for a new episode. You are really appreciated. And if you want to share your thoughts with me, again, you can share them in the comment section if you're watching this video, or if you're on the podcasting platforms, there is a little Q&A tab for you, or you can just hit the contact button on whatever podcasting platform you're listening on and you can reach out to me. So I really appreciate you joining me today. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your presence. I'll see you in my next one, and stay tuned for our disclaimer. The guest and the host at Brown People Problems do not offer individualized therapeutic or medical advice, and our conversations should not be interpreted as such. This podcast is not a replacement for therapy. This podcast exists for educational purposes only. Please consider your circumstances and engage with the content mindfully.